He woke up to find that he had shrunk to the size of an ant. Not only did his usually petite wife now resemble a giant, but even the cat he used to casually pet could now swallow him whole in a single bite. The inconspicuous spider in the corner had become a massive beast out to take his life, and a 1-meter-high table was now a bottomless cliff to him. How is he supposed to survive in this reality? Today we are telling a story of a real-life Gulliver's Travels. Paul had a happy family, a loving relationship with his wife, and a cute daughter. But one day, he woke up suddenly feeling that he had become shorter. This shower head looks a bit higher. Furthermore, his usually well-fitting clothes were a size too big. His wife thought he had just lost weight. But how could there be such sudden, drastic weight loss? So, he immediately went for a checkup, but the doctor found nothing wrong. However, when Paul heard that his current height was 1.76 meters, he was shocked. How did I suddenly get 4 centimeters shorter? The doctor explained that once people start aging, they shrink. But even with aging, how could one suddenly shrink 4 centimeters? So Paul began seeking medical help constantly and increased his exercise, hoping to fight against aging. But a month passed, and the high cost of examinations and treatments left them with a huge debt. Yet Paul's shrinking intensified. He couldn't even wear his wedding ring anymore. By this time, he was already shorter than his wife, Elise, who was 1.65 meters tall. But no doctor could explain this strange, shrinking disease. Helpless, they had to stop the treatment and examinations. A few days later, Elise planned to sell the house because Paul could no longer work, and the debt was overwhelming her. Usually, Paul made the decisions on such matters, so Elise asked for his opinion.
Ou alors on peut aller ailleurs, tu vas aller où, Paul?
Dans un cirque?
Although unwilling, Paul had no better solution. Elise looked back and saw the family cat. Realizing the danger, she threw the cat directly out the door. Unexpectedly, the cat refused to leave. Just as Paul and the cat were locking eyes, a knock sounded at the door. It was the agent bringing people to view the house. Terrified, Paul quickly fled under the bed, only to suddenly hear the reason Elise had made up for selling the house.
Le mari a disparu récemment. Sa femme ne veut pas conserver la maison. Trop de souvenirs. Je vous montre l'autre chambre? Venez.
Paul was furious. He clearly hadn't agreed to sell the house yet, and if he were discovered, he might be taken away for experiments. Did Elise not care about his thoughts at all right now? But Paul's hysteria was so powerless. This scene was witnessed by his daughter, Mia. She backed away slowly, seeming to want to escape from her angry father. Paul didn't want to create distance with his daughter, so the next day, he walked into her dollhouse. He said he liked it there, especially the bed, which looked like someone was sleeping in it. It was a doll. Paul picked it up and started dancing. In this moment, the father and daughter seemed to return to their former warmth, but suddenly, Mia started to scare him. Paul's head buzzed from the vibration of the sound, but after recovering, his first instinct was to comfort his daughter. Witnessing this from the outside, Elise felt incredibly heartbroken. That night, as Elise lay sadly in bed, Paul slowly approached. They didn't speak, they just gazed at each other. After a while, Elise reached out her hand, seeming to want to feel her lover's warmth again. Just like that, another month passed. Paul accepted the reality of being small, but to continue surviving here, he needed some tools, like grappling hooks. However, unexpectedly, the cat crashed through the pet door that day. At this moment, Paul was horrified. The cat was a carnivore, and to him now, it was more terrifying than a tiger. In a moment of carelessness, Paul was scratched by a hook. Smelling blood, the cat let out a low growl from its throat and even licked its lips. Paul quickly took off his clothes to check the wound. Fortunately, it was just a superficial scratch. Taking advantage of the cat not attacking, he immediately grabbed a needle and turned to run. But the cat was in hot pursuit. Narrowly escaping danger, Paul fled into the basement. But soon, due to a misstep, he fell straight from the edge of the stairs into a storage bin. Shortly after, Elise returned home with their daughter, only to find the blood-stained fragment of his tiny clothes. Elise's scream woke the unconscious Paul, and he discovered his wife looking for him everywhere. But Paul was too small now. Elise couldn't hear any of his calls at all. Just then, the cat also followed them into the basement. Paul realized that only by getting the cat to attack him could he attract his wife's attention. But after searching around, Elise fell into grief. She believed Paul had already been eaten by the cat.
C'est toi qui as fait ça? C'est pas possible. Pourquoi t'as fait ça?
De l'ordre! Élise!
At this moment, Paul felt utterly powerless. Generally, only he entered this basement. If Elise never came back, what would he do? Exhausted from shouting, Paul drifted into a groggy sleep. He woke up frozen in the middle of the night. He found a piece of cloth in the storage bin and hung it on a nail. By tearing at it, he made a temporary garment and found some soft wire to use as a belt. Then, he squeezed out through a crack in the storage bin with difficulty because he was hungry. But as mentioned, this was a basement. Where would there be any good food? Turning his head, he saw the needle he had left behind. Picking it up as a weapon, he began to search the basement but found no food. It even seemed there were other dangers in the basement, but he couldn't worry about that now. He suddenly remembered that the water pipe in the basement seemed to leak a bit, so he could survive on that water. Carefully reaching out his hand, the water droplets hit him painfully, but this water could save his life, so he had to endure it. Just like that, Paul not only drank his fill but also took a shower. Time quickly moved to the next day. Paul woke up in a daze and suddenly remembered a line from a book. We must relearn how to live, for everything around us has changed shape. Just then, Mia's voice came from the basement entrance. He tried to respond to his daughter, but his voice was too small. Mia couldn't hear him at all, and the commotion outside sounded like his daughter arguing with Elise. It seemed Elise was forcing Mia to do something. With the sound of a car engine fading away, Paul's world slowly sank. But still holding on to a sliver of hope, he found a piece of chalk and struggled to write his name on the floor. As long as Elise stepped into the basement again, she would surely see it. But several days passed in a row, and there was no movement in the house. Paul was already starving, but fortunately, he remembered the mousetrap he had placed there. There seemed to be a piece of cheese on it. Some ants were foraging on it, and Paul easily drove them away. But eating the cheese wasn't that simple. He brought a scrap iron nail and smashed it down on the mousetrap. Unexpectedly, he missed. Helpless, Paul could only risk his life to carefully pick up the nail. Paul walked to the opposite side of the cheese with the nail and tried again. This time, Paul finally succeeded. Having not eaten for days, he gobbled up the cheese. Thankfully, it wasn't poisoned. But unexpectedly, a spider appeared silently behind him. Sensing something was wrong, Paul immediately waved the nail explicitly. Surprisingly, this move was effective, but Paul knew deep down that there were many spiders in this room, so he had to find a shelter, like a completely sealed cardboard box. He wet some rags with water, then wet the box, and then used the nail to bore a hole. Just like that, a safe shelter appeared. Then he blocked the entrance with books, so he wouldn't have to worry about being eaten by spiders while sleeping. But for the next few days, Elise did not appear again. In all likelihood, that argument was about Elise forcing her daughter to leave with her. Thinking of this, Paul just wanted to get drunk. The basement happened to have wine he had stored, so he dug a hole with the needle. The wooden cork was soon pierced, and Paul immediately brought a small bucket to catch it. He hopes to drown his sorrows in drink, but unfortunately, the agonizing pain of being abandoned follows him like a shadow. Fortunately, he found a doll to keep him company. When he was sad, he poured his heart out to it. Paul knew that the biggest threat now was that spider. That day, emboldened by alcohol, he climbed onto the fish tank, preparing for a fight to the death with the spider. But the spider seemed afraid of him holding a weapon. Paul laughed. This sudden startle caused him to fall directly into the fish tank. Paul scrambles with all his might to climb out, only to find the spider lying in wait right above him. Left with no choice, he dives deep, coming into close contact with the fish. In that moment, he suddenly finds the experience incredibly wondrous. Once the spider left, Paul climbed up. The first thing he did was feed the fish, because he felt like a forgotten fish himself. As he was feeding them, he simply started gnawing on the fish food himself. But on his way back, Paul seemed to hear a sound. Unsurprisingly, it was that spider. Indeed, the spider was lying in wait on his path back, and then it slowly approached Paul. Paul realized there was no retreat, so he raised the needle and began waving it madly at the spider. At this point, the spider was no different from a giant monster in the normal world. Paul was soon backed into a corner. But luckily, he felt some sharp wood chips beside him. Stung by the pain, the spider quickly retreated. After composing himself, Paul finds some scraps of paper, then pulls out a box of matches and strikes them with all his might. That spider might seek revenge. To get through tonight safely, he had to build a fire. After one attempt after another, Paul finally succeeds. With fire present, the spider certainly wouldn't dare approach. True enough, the spider only dared to watch from a distance. But something Paul hadn't anticipated happened very quickly. Waking up the next day, he found he was now even smaller than a mosquito, and mosquitoes didn't even disdain to suck his blood anymore. Paul suddenly realized that if he continued shrinking like this, his only hope for survival was to escape this basement. So he said goodbye to the doll that kept him company and officially began his escape. Since Paul's body size had shrunk to the size of a mosquito, he could easily grip the wood grain on the pillar. Like rock climbing, he climbed higher step by step. Finally, he succeeded. As long as he climbed from the pillar to the adjacent steel frame and reached the gap at the top of the basement, he could follow the cracks in the bricks to the outside of the house. But there was a chasm at the connection between the steel frame and the gap. For Paul, this was no less than a 100-meter cliff. One mistake, and he would likely be shattered to pieces. But he had no retreat, so he charged forward like a warrior. This success boosted Paul's confidence. As long as he passed through the rugged gap ahead, outside lay a vast world. But he soon discovered a spider web appeared in front of him. It should be said that the basement was full of spider webs. As long as he touched a thread, he would likely alert the spider he had a vendetta against. Paul carefully stepped over one thread after another, afraid of waking the spider, which was now several times larger than him. But unexpectedly, in a moment of carelessness, he touched a thread. Paul's heart instantly leaped into his throat. Without surprise, the spider woke up quickly and immediately charged toward Paul. He retreated step by step in terror, but soon he realized he couldn't escape, so he lowered his head and closed his eyes, waiting for death. Unexpectedly, the spider delayed its attack. Paul raised his head in confusion. Just then, the buzzing of a mosquito was heard. It turns out a mosquito has flown into the web and is struggling desperately for its life. The spider was in a hurry to eat. How could it care about Paul? Just like that, Paul made it all the way to the window. But the buzzing outside seemed to foreshadow that the outside world was even more dangerous. However, having just experienced life and death, Paul felt no fear. But unexpectedly, the mesh of the screen was too small. He couldn't get out. Helpless, hungry, and tired, Paul went to sleep right there. But the next day, he was awakened by a stinging pain. His body was being dragged. It was ants. He had become smaller than an ant, and not far away was the hunting spider. Hearing Paul's voice, the spider instantly turned its head. Fortunately, Paul was now smaller than the holes in the iron mesh screen. Since the spider couldn't pass through the mesh, it stared at Paul for a while before retreating helplessly. Paul arrived in the outside world. Looking at his familiar yet strange courtyard, he fell into deep thought. The chirp of an insect suddenly interrupted him. Looking back, it was a moth. The world at this moment was so dangerous to Paul, yet so wonderful. But having experienced life and death, he was no longer afraid. Life is short, everything is destiny, and everything is a precious experience. Actually, seeing the end, we feel this isn't just a sci-fi movie. Aren't we the same? Everyone is on a road of shrinking, not physically, but in mindset. From wanting to change the world in the past, to accepting the world, until finally changing the eyes with which we view the world, starting to relearn how to live. Finally, the film ends with an open ending, and Paul begins his adventure in the new world. All right, friends, see you next time.